Salutations, dear viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm continuing my video about the Irish oppression myth. So I was in the early 18th century with my narrative, which isn't strictly chronological, and I talked about anti-Catholic discrimination passed by the Irish Parliament. Bear in mind, almost every country had an established religion at the time, and membership of the national religion was required for full membership of the state, and those who subscribed to minority religious denominations were discriminated against the world over. The notion of religious equality was really foreign to the 18th century. What was unusual in Ireland, of course, is that it was the majority who were discriminated against by the minority. There were similar situations which pertained in Eastern Europe and parts of the Ottoman Empire or so forth. Rather depends on what one means by a country. In parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Orthodox majority was discriminated against by the Catholic minority and so forth. So the fact there was religious discrimination was not unusual at the time. So it's difficult to pin this blame on England. Supposing we'd been completely separate, we, as a Catholic majority, would we not have discriminated against the Protestant minority? It's highly likely that we would have, as indeed was the case in every other Catholic country. And many people associated Catholicism with absolute monarchies. One saw in the major Catholic states of Europe, in Spain, Portugal, France, the Austrian Empire, and so forth. Some people associated Protestantism with parliamentary government, which of course isn't entirely fair. Yes, there were countries which had some degree of parliamentary government, such as the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Sweden, and so forth, but there were some of the German states, notably Prussia, where that was not the case. So what we saw in the 18th century in Ireland was one set of Irishmen mistreating another. Now, virtually all of us had ancestors from Wales, Scotland, or England. So often it was the descendants of the more recent immigrants discriminating against those whose immigrant ancestry was more distant. But again, nationalists try and refract this through a prism of Anglophobia to say that it's always England's fault. Now, of course, there were anti-Catholic people in England and hibernophobic people in England, so I'm not saying an Englishman is necessarily innocent. Right, but we need to take more responsibility for that for certain groups within Ireland. That Irish Protestant minority was perhaps 25% of the population, but they tend to be urban, better armed, more literate. The official language was English, and of course most of us were Irish speaking, particularly in the south and west. So Protestants were almost exclusively English speaking, which gave them an advantage in the job market, working with the government and so on. The Catholic majority, well, we lost almost our entire upper class in the 17th century in two waves. 1607, the flight of the Earls. After the end of that Anglo-Spanish War, there was some claim that there was a renewed rebellion planned, and so a lot of our aristocracy fled, principally to Spain, the wild geese, because they thought that James I might arrest them. James I, King of Ireland, King of England, King of Scots, except he's the sixth in Scotland. Then there was the Treaty of Limerick in 1689, after the Siege of Limerick, and rights for the Catholic majority were guaranteed. However, then the Irish Parliament didn't want to honour that. William III was in a bind. If the 1688 revolution meant anything, it was parliamentary supremacy, not absolute monarchy, which James II had tried to uphold. And there's another point that there is selective amnesia about James II, King of Ireland, King of England, King of Scots. So he was a Catholic monarch, and obviously we're a Catholic majority in Ireland, but he's ruling Catholic Scotland, Wales, and England. And he was decades, centuries ahead of his time with his active toleration, active indulgence, guaranteeing equality for Catholics and Anglicans. And so when he came to Ireland, tens of thousands of Irish Catholics rallied to his cause, seemed to see absolutely no contradiction between fighting for the King of Ireland and being Irish. So he was the King of Ireland. Nobody disputed that. There was no nationalism as we know it in the 17th century. Nationalism as we know it was invented in the 1790s, largely by East Coast Anglophone middle-class Protestants. Nothing wrong with belonging to any of those groups, but I'm just showing they're quite atypical. So that was that. Our upper class had gone, and class discrimination was the norm the world over at the time. Society was very hierarchical. It was difficult to be accepted as a doyen if one did not hail from the upper orders. And bearing in mind, most people were illiterate in Ireland, as in every other country at the time. There'd been denominational fights before in the 1640s. People talk about the Portadown massacre, which definitely happened, the Protestant immigrants being slain, and there were anti-Catholic massacres later on under Cromwell, Drogheda, and Waterford. The one thing about Drogheda people often overlook is Drogheda was an English town around 1649 when he arrived. The people of Drogheda were regarded as English by themselves and everybody else. The thing is, they were Catholic English people, descendants of medieval settlers. So that was that. Even though their families had been in Ireland for several centuries, they were viewed as being English. So it's difficult to sustain the argument that this is an anti-Irish massacre. That was the old English community on the east coast there. Now, what else? So there was very little left of the Catholic upper class in the 18th century, as I was saying. There had been sectarian bloodbaths in the rest of Europe, the 30 Years' War, the French Wars of Religion, and so forth. So it could have been a lot worse for us in the 17th century. In the 18th century, it was bad enough as it was. And the Catholic hierarchy wasn't allowed in Ireland in the 18th century, and that really lobotomized us, the Catholic community, because the clergy were the intellectuals. Teachers, and certainly professors, were largely priests, monks, and nuns. In rural communities, they were the font of education. So many priests had gone abroad to be educated on the continent, and they were allowed into Ireland with governmental permission. They were suspected of being recruiting sergeants for the Jacobite cause. So people often overlook this, that the Irish royal family, which is the same one as the English and Scots royal family, there was a split. The Jacobites, the descendants of James II, they claimed the throne. They were the senior line, but it had gone to a cadet branch after, the death of Queen Anne. The Hanoverians, is it 59th in line to the throne because of the first Protestant one, so Catholics were excluded from the line of succession. And in Ireland, most Irish Catholics, it said anecdotally, supported the Jacobites. So again, nobody seems to have questioned that we would share the same monarch as England and Scotland. There was no Jacobite rebellion in Ireland in 1745 or around 1720, whereas there was in Scotland, which shows us that we're more content. All right, it's partly because the old pretender and then the young pretender, Bonnie Prince Charlie, did not land in Ireland. Why not? Less fertile territory for them. So they were Catholic claimants, and even though the majority of us were Catholics, they did not think we would rebel. Is it because they thought they were more content? They wanted to succeed. There's this well-known adage, never trust the bite of a dog, the kick of an ass, or the word of an Englishman. Is that not Anglophobic? So there is some anti-English bigotry in Ireland. Not very much now, there used to be more. And fair enough, there was anti-Hibernian prejudice in England, though I think that's entirely disappeared now. Anyway, it's little better than saying that we're all thick, all us Irish people, than to say that the English are dishonest. Yes, there are dishonest English people. I don't think particularly more than any other nationality. If they are, on average, more dishonest than anybody else, I would like to see some empirical proof. Anyway, there have been ghastly chapters in our history. There was the potato famine in the 1840s. We all know that 1847 was the worst year, Black 47. There was the 1798 rebellion. I already talked about how the English Civil War affected Ireland, or to be called the Irish Civil War. There was the 9 Years' War in the late 16th century. So there were massacres carried out, including by the Crown Forces. Dursey Island in West Cork was the site of a horrific atrocity, and that comes from English sources. So this article is not a whitewash, and I go for fairness and balance. So you'll see I have perspective here, and I acknowledge crimes committed by English soldiers in Ireland. We should also acknowledge crimes committed by Irish soldiers or rebels, whatever you want to call them, where they're fighting for or against the Crown, crimes committed against people of both religious denominations, and not to be so selective and constantly trying to bolster an Anglophobic or anti-Protestant narrative. Now, it could be that there were more crimes committed by the Crown Forces or loyalist terrorists, partly because they had more capability to do it, because they had more weapons. The Crown Forces were subject to courts martial. They could be tried for wrongdoing. When did rebels punish their men for committing crimes against civilians? I'd like to hear about some cases. So this selectivity shows some Anglophobic trope in Republican and nationalist discourse. Thinking to the foggy dew, that song about the Easter rising, through the leaden rain, 7 tongues of flame made perfidious Albion real. So perfidious Albion is a well-known saying. What the French used to say under Napoleon was plainly racist. It would be equally stupid and distasteful to talk of alcoholic Ireland or terrorist Ireland or something like that. But anyway, that is the casual Anglophobia which informs much of Republican discourse.